question that exists is, what does that mean that we follow the Shulchan Aruch? And that leads into a further question of what really is the process of Halacha. If you look in terms of any legal system, let's say in Canada, we have a distinction between two types of law. Okay, in terms of the basic nature of law. One is what we call the codes, the Criminal Code of Canada, a statute, and so forth. This is the determination of the law as determined in the legislature, in Parliament or whatever. Criminal Code of Canada states here are very specific laws, and it's stated here's the law, it's black and white, and so forth. That's what's referred to when we talk in terms of a code. A code is a statement of law determined by a legislative body, which means this legislative body has authority to determine laws. Okay. Then questions emerge on how this law applies in variant situations, and that's where you get into issues of judicial determination. In Canada and in countries, it usually emerges as the law is violated, but usually that emerges out of an issue of what the law really means and what the code really means in its statement. And that leads to judicial determination, and that leads to what are called judgments, okay, cases. And there are legal conclusions at the end of the case that basically explains codes. Okay, that's basically our legal structure in Canada, in the world, so forth and so forth. Okay. The simple understanding of Halacha of many people is the same determinations applies within Jewish law. That we have codes and that we have psak, judgments. And the codes are perceived to be some type of legislation. That some authority basically makes a statement of law which is the statement of law. And worked out the same way that a legislative body writes down that law. People believe that certain statements are made from Har Sinai, that they have some perception that there were codes at Har Sinai of laws. Okay, other people think that the Mishnah was such a code of law because the authoritative body of the Sanhedrin of Rabbi stated this is the law and made statements as legislation and so forth. And then it comes up again with the final rendition of the Gemara. Somehow people say this is a perception of a code, and it perceives that the Shulchan Aruch was some perception of a code, that basically the law is black and white as written in the Shulchan Aruch because it is a legislative statement. Okay? Okay? That's incorrect. Right? Chaim, that's what you're pointing to?
No, I'm thinking about something else.
Okay. Okay. That's incorrect. Okay? Especially as it applies to
Which is right?
The fact that codes within Jewish law are similar to legislation. Okay? The Shulchan Aruch, which is written like a code, okay, in fact, is a judicial document. It's not a legislative document, it's a judicial document. Okay? Rav Yosef Karo was making judicial decisions on a variety of laws and came to certain conclusions that he said this is the way the law should be followed. Okay? And what that means is his determination was not creating the law as a legislature creates the law or writes down the law. is Rav Yosef Karo basically looked at all the principles of law that existed prior to him, what all the Rishonim beforehand said, and all the people
were they
said,
legislative or
they were
judicial?
all themselves judicial.
Oh, so it's a tradition right from the beginning.
Right from Har Sinai.
Well,
Right.
Moshe Rabbeinu was a judge. Like
Well, Moshe Rabbeinu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the fact is HaKadosh Baruch Hu may have legislated when he says, don't cook a mother don't cook a lamb in the mother's milk. The fact is he's writing a legislation. But the subsequent analysis of that legislation is all judicial.
Judicial, that's interesting.
And Torah Sheba'al Peh is all working with the principles of understanding that very limited legislation. What exactly?
Rabbanan?
No, that's Doraisa analysis. Judicial determination are not what you would call Rabbanan. In addition, what you're saying, there were legislations throughout history. In addition to that, there were legislations made by various Sanhedrins, right? You know, there was a legislation that chicken and milk is also prohibited. That's a Rabbanan. That's a legislative statement. And then there's also the roles of the Rabbanim judicially, trying to understand the Doraisa legislation, the biblical legislation.
So the legislation, the code, and the judicial approach is understanding the legislation? Or applying the legislation? Okay.
The original legislation, Doraisa, okay, so the fact is, if you go back to the original understanding of Doraisa,
right,
what you're left with is the nature of what is Torah Sheba'al Peh. So with the way the Rambam understands it is that there is the legislation in Torah Sheba'al, right? Like Lo Tavashel G'day V'Chalevi Mo. And then there were additional legislative statements. Like, for example, the Ritzuas of Tefillin, the straps of Tefillin should be black. Okay? So that was legislation. God said this is the law. Okay. In addition to that, God also gave over principles of analysis. He said, basically, that there's a way of analyzing Torah Shebechtav through the verses and so forth to determine other principles of law. Okay? And there is the analysis.
Where does it specifically say that it gives the rules of learning of laws? Where is that?
The actual no, Chumash doesn't give any. The Chumash doesn't give laws.
So where is that?
That's in Torah Sheba'al Peh.
That's Torah Sheba'al Peh.
That's Torah Sheba'al Peh.
I mean, there's 13.
Yeah, that's what Rishmael says it's 13, but other people say there's different principles.
So where does that come from? That's it.
That's all Torah Sheba'al Peh. Yeah, it's different Gemaras and Midrashim and stuff like that. The fact of the matter is that in Jewish thought, the original revelation of the legislation was not just a revelation of the legislation, it was a revelation of the judicial principles to be applied in understanding the original legislation, and not only that, to derive new insights through the study of the Chumash text. And then there's also the fact that Torah Sheba'al Peh raises new principles and new ideas in determining further law. So what occurs is that there's a legislation in Torah, which is, let's say, the original legislation being what God actually stated as law. Some of those things actually written down, other things then presented orally. The Rambam says that when they're presented orally like that, they are like the truths of tefillin are black. Says that's what we call halacha Moshe Sinai. But the fact is then he says, but other laws and legal principles, theories of analysis, can be determined through the study, analysis of the text, and the judicial analysis of the laws. Okay, which raises further principles and further ideas and so forth.
Which text?
Yeah, the Chumash text. At that point in time, the Chumash text, talking Doraisa.
Right.
And then, so basically, what Torah Sheba'al Peh is in Torah Sheba'al Peh there is a collection of some oral legislation that God revealed only orally, and but most of it is actually judicial analysis, which of the laws, of the legislative laws, and usually which applies principles that may have arrived from the Torah, that God may have given, like the concept of Kal v'chomer, that the principle of applying something, if something applies to something that's more lenient, then you may be able to assume that it applies to something more stringent. That's an acceptable analysis of determining law.
Right.
Okay, and that could be because God said it. Could have come from Sora, but it could also be because God said it. Or another thing is the fact that there were principles of how to further gain understanding of the law through the analysis of the Chumash text. Okay, like for example, let's take an example of let's say that you're allowed to violate the halacha for a halacha to save someone's life, right? Okay, so you have an idea. Okay, so where do you get that from? So we have a legal principle. Okay, so where do we get that from?
It's not derisa?
Yeah, it is derisa. By the way, judicial analysis is all basically derisa. I mean, you get into technical analysis where the Rambam's is derisa is the rabbinic analysis of the Chumash and the biblical and the biblical laws and the biblical legislation. So something that is derived by the Rabbanim is still derisa. Okay, so when you say
it's
that
not judicial anymore,
that's judicial. That is judicial.
That's not exceptional legislative?
No, that's not legislative. It's judicial. It's judicial because you're not creating the law. You're saying, here's the law. Okay, now what does it mean in this particular case? Applying the principles that exist within the law.
In our judgment.
In our judgment.
Okay.
Okay. So, for example, if you have a case let's say the case. So if someone comes up to you and says, kill that person, or I'm going to kill you. Okay, you're not allowed to kill that person. Why? So the fact is that in general,
the person who told you to kill.
Right.
The person who said you should kill the person.
No, I mean, Reuben says to Shimon, kill Levi or I'll kill you. You can't kill Levi.
Right.
Okay? So the point is the question emerges like this, is that okay, what's the argument? The argument is Chai Behem, that you are allowed I mean, there's different arguments where we learn it from, but one of the arguments is from the idea of Chai Behem, that you should live among Torah. That's the pasuk. So therefore, the analysis is that pasuk further teaches us that you are to live through the doing of mitzvot rather than dying to them. Therefore, if you'll die because you'll keep Shabbos, because of this following of Shabbos, you're allowed to violate Shabbos to save your life.
Right.
Okay. What about killing the other person to save your life?
What if you're not being? What if he's saying, I can either kill him or you choose? So you're not actually doing any of the killing.
Okay, so let me get to that. See, that you're already making a distinction, but I'll tell you what Tosfos says in another case. So the case over there is, and this is all from, and he says, if who says that your blood is redder than the other person's blood? Therefore, one person is going to die, right? So the point is that you can't do the avera to save your own life, because who says that your life is more significant than the other life? So because the other life is going to die. On the other hand, Tosfos raises another question. He says, and it's somewhat similar to what you're saying, Tom. Tosfos raised the question, says, what happens if someone comes up to you and says, okay, I'm going to kill you unless you let me pick you up, right, and throw on that little baby. Okay? In other words, I'm not asking you to do the act of murder. Okay? Question is that okay? And Tosfos says you don't have to. You can let yourself be picked up, because who says the baby's blood is more redder than yours? In that case, you're not asked to do a Ma'aser Avera, right? The point is that case, it's like one person's going to die. Who says it's the other person versus yours? So he says, and the thing that hits you from the Gemara is this is all from Svara. This is all from rational analysis. So the Torah calls upon you to be thinking, to analyze things, okay? And then it says, in terms of determining law, there's some legislation in Chumash, there's some legislation in Torah Shebaal Peh where God just states a law, okay? But what really exists is that God gave over principles to how to make legal determinations. God gave over principles of how to analyze psukim to come up with further insights and further laws. Okay? Okay, because you see from this extra pasuk that there's a further understanding of the law here, and then there is the need for your own analysis. Okay, that whole world of analysis is all doraisa, because it's basically attempting to determine the Torah that God gave on Har Sinai, the application of the Torah that God gave on Har Sinai. Okay. So when so the determination when it says right, it says don't cook a lamb in its mother's milk. It says it 3 times, so we learn 3 surim. There's an isser bishul, there's an isser of cooking it, there's an isser of eating it, and there's an isser of hana, of benefiting from it. Now, the truth is I believe the Chazon Ish who said this. He said how they determine the actual legal details from their analysis. Now, how they figured out that these 3, the fact this pasuk was repeated 3 times, turned out to be these specific laws. Says that's a science of drasha that we no longer have. Okay, we no longer have that science of drasha, of being dorish psukim. Okay, I believe it's the Chazon Ish says. He says that was lost with the end of the Mishnayik and the Talmudic age. To understand how they were able to derive from this extra letter this specific technical world. There are others who say the truth is that some of these technical laws were actually part of the oral legislation, and what Chazal really did is connected the oral legislation to show a remiss to it a source for it in the text. But the fact is what you're really left of, and you really see this when you learn Gemara and so forth, is so much of Jewish law is actually what I would classify broadly. It's not really the same as judicial determination that you find in our courts, okay, because there's drushes and stuff like that, but it basically is a world of analysis. Right. And significantly decision making. Right. And with that analysis and decision making came disagreements. Okay? You had disagreements between individuals and so forth. Okay. What then occurs, okay, is that as you saw these varying disagreements and so forth, at certain times in history, okay, there were certain I don't want to say synods in the sense of a real live working out of people. I mean, this is what happens in many ways what Rabbi did with the Mishnah when he concludes that we hold like Beis Hillel over Beis Shammai. That was a determination of a final conclusion. In other words, yeah, there were machlokasim because it was all decision making. Then what occurred is that a certain realm within this became the normative position. So let's take Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Disagreeing Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai on certain laws, analysis, or they both had these analysis of the judicial determinations. Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai having a disagreement what the Torah law is, because a lot of Torah law is this judicial determination, and then what occurs is that there is some type of point where a decision is made that into the future we're going to follow this position versus that position. Okay? So therefore Beit Hillel now becomes the standard position. Okay? That will now be the position that will be normative within Klal Yisrael. Okay? That happens with some certain determinations in the Mishnah. It happened with certain conclusions when the Babli was concluded. Okay? A lot of different machlokesim. We paskin in one way. Okay? Into the future. Sometimes this analysis was may have happened over years. It didn't happen so forthright through a convention. Other times there are continuing machlokesim. So Rishonim disagreed on what the normative law out of certain machlokesim in Gemara was. In other words, you'd have a machlokas in the Gemara, and then you'd have machlokas in Rishonim that say basically, in this situation, you might have, this Rishon says we're going to pass him like Rabbi, and this person says no, we're going to pass him like Abaye. Okay, although there are generally some principles that are there, and you look in Piskei Halacha in the rules of Psak that you have what as a normative way. We see machlokas in Amarayim, machlokas in Tanayim, who basically are the ones that we follow that became the normative position. But then they were all basically, but it was really all judicial determinations. The original determination of the analysis of the verse and the analysis of the law, and then the way we determine between variant opinions in various positions. Okay? Now, what happened is that what the Rambam did in writing what was the first code is, and this is really where the issue arose in terms of people not really getting what a code is about. The Rambam recognized that the world of Jewish law is a world of analysis. It's a world of knowing the principles and you being called upon to make decisions based upon the knowledge and the analysis of Shas and so forth, of the viewpoints, and coming to be called upon to make decisions. This was obviously a very heavy onus on the average Jew in the sense of whether, what is the law? Okay? So what the Rambam did is he made a determination that he was going to state what the law was, what the final conclusion was.
I didn't feel well earlier in the evening.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Okay. But Chaim, maybe not tonight, but I am going to explain how this ties into modern orthodoxy down the road. Okay. The fact is that what the Rambam did was he did not legislate. Rambam did not have legislative authority. Okay?
Is it Mishnah Torah?
This is Mishnah Torah. He is not a legislator. He didn't have a legislative body creating legislature. Sanhedrin could legislate. Now the truth is, I was talking with Doraisis before, when Sanhedrin legislated, those are drobbanans. So there was a situation where there was a legislation of that basar off, the chicken, would also be considered that a person should not eat, does not cook chicken with milk. Now the truth is there is actually a shita that holds that it's actually deraisa. That holds as deraisa. There are shitas that hold. There's a shita that holds that this legislation was not binding.
So the shita
is a position. It's a viewpoint. Okay. The fact is
legislation.
Well, no. The fact is no. It's a viewpoint based upon even judicial. The fact is there are different viewpoints. Okay, so the fact is that when you know, like for example, the mitzvah of puravu.
Right.
Okay, there's a viewpoint that says that women are mechuyev in puravu, that they are obligated in puravu.
Well, they're kind of necessary.
What?
They're kind of necessary.
Right. But that's an interesting question of what actually is this legal obligation. The fact is that there's a legal obligation. Then there comes the issue of, like I'm pointing out, that you take a law like puravu. There's a commandment to have kids. Does that commandment apply to women or not? So the truth is that's a machlokas Tanaim. That was a disagreement among Tanaim. What it was there was a law that there was some indications and some questions whether the law applies to women or doesn't apply to women, and there's judicial determination. Okay, some people said it does apply, other people said it doesn't apply to women. Those are judicial determinations, and then what became the normative law was that this law doesn't apply to women. But the point is now there are cases where you have an argument where Chazal legislated and they created certain drabbanans. Okay, now the simple way of understanding a drabbanan is that it was the legislation of the Sanhedrin.
Well, this was specifically through the Sanhedrin when there was unity.
It would seem to be. That would be the simple way of understanding it. That the Sanhedrin had the power of legislation and create new laws, and that would be drabbanans.
Right.
Now the fact is that the Rambam says that the best in a shofet has the power. The best in a shevet had the power to make such legislation on certain shvatim. Okay, so in Shevet Yehuda there was there was a Supreme Court of Yehuda, and they were able to make legislation on that would be applicable to Shevet Yehuda, whatever. And okay, whether that meant the people in the land of Shevet Yehuda or whether it meant people who were part of Shevet Yehuda, even they lived somewhere else, that's a different question. But the point is that it would seem to be that there was the power of legislation in the Sanhedrin. The fact is, it's not so simple, because what you find is that it seems to be that there was some legislative authority and there was some disagreements about whether this legislation happened, didn't happen, whether there was such a legislation, whether there was not such a legislation.
Whether Sanhedrin passed.
Well, it seems to be like, for example, you have a disagreement about chicken and milk. There's some people who say that it's actually deraisa. There's other people who say it's drabbanan, and there's some, and there was one sheet in the Gemara who said that there was no even rabbinic prohibition of chicken and milk. So the point is how did he understand this? So he obviously said that there was never such a legislation. But the question is, it gets a little bit more murky in terms of understanding, how, it's not so clear how that legislative, at least I have a lot of questions in terms of understanding how that legislation actually worked. I'm sure if I put some time into it, I can find some better answers. But I've always wanted to look into it, but I never have. Right. I think there's some book out on trying to understand the whole legislative procedure of rabbinic. That's rabbinic law. When we get to the Rambam, though, the Rambam is when he writes a code, he's not legislating. He did not create any law. What the Rambam is doing in writing a code is really judicial. It's his determinations of the law, which means from his analysis of the principles of the law, he came to these final statements of law.
So
some of them drabbanan, some of them deraisa, but these are statements of law.
So what is Mishnah Torah then?
Mishnah Torah is the Rambam's book of codes.
On everything.
On everything.
Okay.
But he wrote it as a code. So he says, don't do this, do this. Okay, and the fact is that
based on his understanding.
Based upon his understanding as judicial determination.
Okay.
Okay? It's not similar to the Criminal Code of Canada, which is a legislative document.
So, and did anyone argue on his Mishnah Torah?
And that's why the Rabbi got upset. That's why a lot of people got upset with the Rambam. Because they felt that it was inappropriate for the Rambam to do so, because what people won't see is the fact that he is a decision maker. He is making decisions on judicial issues. Therefore, the Ravid who's a contemporary of the Rambam. Some people say even greater than the Rambam, but I'm not going to get into an argument who's greater between the Rabbi and the Rambam.
This was the same generation? Or?
Same generation. He basically sit there, and that's why you see the goes a Rabbi on the Rambam, that right there when the Rambam says this law, the Rabbi says, I disagree. The law is not like that. And that was really the first issue with the Rambam, that you shouldn't have written a code, because you're giving an impression that your decision, what you are doing is a judicial decision based upon your analysis of the information before. You aren't presenting the information that pre-exists your decision, which includes the reality of disagreements. Okay? The fact of the matter is a principle that you are making a judicial decision. You are coming to a certain conclusion as you determine it. Okay? And and therefore the Rabbi says, guess what? I come to a different conclusion than you. And that has a voice as well. Because you aren't legislating, you are presenting your viewpoint.
And was there any Sanhedrin at the time?
No.
Was there anything?
No. Sanhedrin didn't exist since maybe 250. There's no authoritative body to say this is the conclusion. That and the Sanhedrin at that time, on the right, is not legislating. It is the Supreme Court, and makes a final conclusion on judicial law. Something different. But the fact is, once it makes its final conclusion on judicial law, they understand that yes, there was a disagreement, and the Sanhedrin has made a decision. The point is that's judicial. But the fact is all our law today, all our halacha today, is the result, is really judicial. Every person involved in halacha, they're all making decisions. Okay? And the codes that we have are all the decisions of certain individuals written as codes.
So how does that work exactly? Like why? So why can't? So how's that binding?
It's exactly the issue. So the Rambam statement was never binding.
They say that, but people say that we as cholesterol accepted the Rambam and accepted.
No, the Rambam. Wait a second. The Rambam never became fully binding. No one. The Rambam wrote a code.
Why is everyone?
You learn it because you learn it. It's learning, and the Rambam's positions is considered, okay, in some analysis and determinations and so forth and so forth. He's voicing his opinion. In anyone else voicing an opinion, you hear the giants of the past. You need the information.
So what about like in the Gemara that'll say something about, let's say, like Arafat?
About what?
So it's making a decision. But the fact is,
that legislated though, or is that?
If it's legislated, it's reporting either a Halacha Moshe Sinai, it's reporting. If it's making a legislative statement, it's either reporting what a previous Bezdin legislated, or it's reporting what a Kodesh Baruch Hu may have said to Moshe Rabbeinu. A lot of times, it's maybe reporting a previous decision, or it's rendering a decision based upon the analysis.
So what is our standard then? That's the biggest shot. That's the question. What is our standard? What is our index to go to? What is our...
And the process of analysis.
Of what?
Of the material. Of all the material.
So you do the Rambam, you look at the Ravid, you look at...
Well, you go back and understand what the issues are. Okay, I mean, the fact is that's why most people want some kind of straightforward statement. This is the law. The fact of the matter is any statement made, this is the law, today is really a result of analysis.
But there is a law, but there still is legislation.
There was original legislation on Har Sinai, but it was a very specific legislation. There was different aspects of what was legislated. A lot of it were principles of how to determine and understand things and make analysis. And what you have is people involved in decision making.
The Masorah, like why is then what it was?
Masorah is a continuation of that information.
Of the legislation or the analysis?
Of everything. See, the problem is you're looking upon the analysis as being secondary. See, when Christianity argued about the man-made law, they said, hey, you rabbis, you're involved in determining the law, okay? And therefore the law is not fully divine. They called what the rabbis did the man-made law. The argument against it is, guess what? That's exactly what the Kodesh Baruch Hu wants.
Right.
Okay?
The pasuk about it.
Okay, so the fact of the matter is, yes. Okay, lo b'shemaim. The fact is that God did not give over a code. It did not give over black and white. It gave over a process of analysis that you have to be involved with in the study and the involvement to come up with the conclusions. Okay, now that information comes out that there is legislation in the Torah Shebechtav. There's oral legislation that's part of Torah Shebal Peh, Halacha Moshe Sinai. There is the laws we derive through drushes and stuff like that. And once you get involved in the laws of derived through drushes, which is through analysis of verses and so on and so forth, once you bring involved the concept of analysis, you open up the possibility for there to be disagreements between human beings in thought. But what you're really doing, and the reason that Christianity had a problem with it, is that, wait a second, now human beings are involved. It's no longer the pure divine statement.
Right.
Guess what? That's the way God wanted it. God wanted human beings thinking. In the determination of what's right and wrong.
So when people make statements saying it says this is binding, this is this, it's like, what is binding?
So now the point is you're jumping ahead.
I know.
You're jumping ahead to, okay, so I've stated position. So what happens is Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai had disagreements on laws. Okay?
Right.
In other words, given all the information they both had, all the knowledge there was, Beis Hillel had all the knowledge of what God legislated, all the knowledge of what God legislated orally, all the process of analysis and studies and so on, all the information. They came to disagreements in certain principles, which opens the idea that it's a decision-making process. Now, what happened is there came a certain time where, for one reason or another, the decision was made that we have to choose between these two positions into the future. Okay? So that rather than looking at the entire spectrum of possibilities, the Jewish law became, in terms of practical application of Jewish law, became narrowed down by saying we now will follow Beis Hillel and not Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai's analysis is still Torah Shebal Peh. It's still Torah. I recently read Beis Shammai raises a question. Beis Shammai says that you can only divorce a wife if she was mizaneh. It seems to me Beis Shammai says the only justification for divorcing your wife is if she has committed adultery. Okay, that in other words, you need adultery in order to be able to divorce your wife. So the question exists where the pasuk says is that a man divorces a wife, and if she doesn't marry someone else, he can take her back. So people ask the question on Beis Shammai, how can he do it? If she's committed adultery, she's usher on him.
Right.
So a lot of people start giving a whole variety of terutzim. Like, for example, one teretz is they say that the pasuk is talking Beis Shammai, according to Beis Shammai, that the guy wasn't allowed to divorce his wife, but he divorced her anyways. Okay. Another answer is that you cannot divorce your wife against her will unless she commits adultery. But if both people in the marriage, the husband and wife, want a divorce, and even according to Beis Shammai, they can have a divorce. That the Beis Shammai is saying it's only the case where to force a wife to accept a divorce, okay, which is not our. That then has to be case because the Raisa, a husband can force a wife to get a divorce. So according to Beis Shammai, that's only in cases of adultery. But in other cases, if the husband and wife both agree to a divorce, then they can do it. And then if they change their mind and say we want to get back together again, then it's the puzzle. But the fact is that, and then people talk this out. The reason they talk that, even though we don't paskin like Beis Shammai, okay, it's still Torah. Okay, but the actual practical law, psak halacha, is according to Beis Hillel. Now, the fact is that there's a whole spectrum of Torah, and then what happened was at certain points in time in history, somehow this Torah, this saying, in the future we will only work within these parameters of psak. Okay, that happened now, but it's still understanding that they're making judicial determinations. Okay, that happened with the Mishnah, it happened with, and it's not so simple how this works, with the Gemara, and then that happened again with the Shulchan Aruch, what that means, and that's something we have to get to, because the Shulchan Aruch is not a clear-cut black and white statement, but the first thing you have to understand is the nature of halacha as judicial determinations. Okay? That even when we see a code such as the Rambam, it's not the Rambam writing a code as you talk about the Criminal Code of Canada. It's the Rambam took his judicial determinations and wrote them up as a code. And for that, he was heavily critiqued because he was misrepresenting the fact that his legal decisions were really judicial determinations, and behind of them, all of them, is also a tremendous world of issues and disagreements and so forth and so forth. And that's why a lot of people say the Rabbi should have said, that people said the Rambam should have said, there's a machlokas in the Gemara, I paskin this way. Okay, or something like that. But the fact of the matter is the Rambam didn't do that because he wanted to create something that people could just look up and say, here's the law. Okay? And other people said, no, other people challenged him for doing that. The point is that whenever anyone has done something like that and written a code and presenting it, that people do take it to mean that here is the law, as if it is black and white law. And the fact is no code in Jewish history has ever been black and white law. It has always been the judicial determinations of the person who wrote the code, which is quite legitimate in the sense that these were great Talmidei Chachamim, great poskim, who rendered what they felt the halacha to be. Okay? What people don't recognize is when doing so, I mean, people involved in learning understood what was happening and so forth. People don't recognize in doing so that they don't recognize the nature of what Jewish law is about. You see the difference in the Rambam? It seems to be, read it, this black and white. You look at the Torah says, this Rishon held like this, this Rishon held like that, I paskin like this. So you're saying here's the final law. Okay? Okay, and this comes up again. So I think that's important to understand. What happened with the Shulchan Aruch is the Shulchan Aruch is a new code. Rav Yosef Karo also wanted to present a law so that people would have a straightforward law to follow. Here's a simple statement. Here's the law, and and the fact is that what occurred was, we have to look at what exactly occurred, because even there, when we talk about what we mean by Shulchan Aruch, we don't really mean just Rav Yosef Karo Sefer, is that somehow the spectrum of what would be acceptable in the determination of Jewish law became narrowed down, but it was not narrowed down the way people think it was. It was still part of the process of judicial determination. In terms of understanding what our original statement about the nature of the Doraisa law and its nature in terms of judicial determination and its nature as really part of people thinking, the best place to look at it is actually from another Sefer of the Rambam. Okay? The Hadama to his Perish Mishnayos. The Rambam's introduction to the Perish Mishnayos, he presents the nature of Torah Sheba'al Peh, and there you'll see the idea of judicial determination. Okay?